There's a new major leak of top secret information, except in this case, nobody really seems to care about who it is who leaked this top secret information. There's no FBI raid at Mar-a-Lago in order to find the top secret leaker. People have just accepted the fact that there's yet another leak of top secret information, since it happens every single day, and provided that it serves the establishment agenda rather than undermines it, as is true of this case, it's just considered to be how Washington and the media function. So this particular story is about how U.S. intelligence purports to discover a new deal between Cuba and China that would call for the placing of Cuban military and spy bases in Cuba, which is 90 miles away from the coast of Florida, although not part of the United States. It is a sovereign country, Cuba is, and the question becomes, do they have the right to decide what happens on their soil without the United States having to approve? Here's the Wall Street Journal article from June 8th that reads, quote, Cuba to host secret Chinese spy base focusing on the U.S. Beijing agrees to pay Havana several $1 billion for eavesdropping facilities. China and Cuba have reached a secret agreement for China to establish an electronic eavesdropping facility on the island in a brash new geopolitical challenge by Beijing to the U.S., according to U.S. officials familiar with highly classified intelligence. So presumably this is a crime to leak this, although I promise you no one is going to ever look for the leaker. An eavesdropping facility in Cuba, roughly 100 miles from Florida, would allow Chinese intelligence services to scoop up electronic communications throughout the southeastern U.S., where many military bases are located, and monitor U.S. ship traffic. Officials familiar with the matter said that China has agreed to pay cash-strapped Cuba several $1 billion to allow it to build the eavesdropping station, and that the two countries had reached an agreement in principle. There was a newer Wall Street Journal article from yesterday that provided more details, in particular saying that the base will be a military base that will host Chinese military troops. And we're already seeing calls from many people in the United States saying this is something that should not be permitted. The United States should take very aggressive action and tell the Cubans they are not permitted, even though it's their soil and their sovereign country, to host the Chinese military on Cuban soil. Here, for example, is a video of John Bolton on CNBC on June 20th of 2023. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I think we need to make our point in response to substance, really, not style. So let's take the Cuba thing as an example. You know, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, as you said, we had a deal, in effect, with the Soviets. They wouldn't try and put military or additional problematic facilities in Cuba, and we wouldn't overthrow the Castro government. I mean, you can like that deal or not, but that was the deal. We have no such deal with China, and I think we ought to make it clear to the successors to the Castros in Cuba that if they go ahead with this China operation, we don't consider ourselves bound by any agreement with the Soviet Union as it affects China. I mean, I think we've got to put some pressure on Cuba here. I'd go a lot further than that in many respects, but I'd at least make it clear we're not going to sit by while China increases its presence 90 miles off our shores.
Well, what do we do then?
Well, as I say, I think we make it clear to the Cuban leadership that their regime is in jeopardy, as it was before the deal with the Soviets. I think Cuban Americans would support that, and I think we've got to make it clear that that this foreign establishment on soil of a Western Hemisphere country violates the Monroe Doctrine, and we're not going to accept it.
All right, do you hear that? John Bolton says, we're going to tell them, we entered a deal with them where we said, look, we might overthrow your government. We'll agree not to overthrow your government as long as you do what we want. Namely, you don't put Russian weapons or Russian troops on your soil because it's too close to the United States. So apparently the United States has the right, as it sees it, to just go overthrowing governments whenever it wants, unless those governments do what we tell them. In particular, he cited the Monroe Doctrine, which, according to John Bolton, means that every country in the Latin American region, not just Cuba, but Central America and South America, is basically the property of the United States, or our zone of influence because it's so close to our border or in the same hemisphere as us. And the United States has invoked that doctrine many times to overthrow governments in Latin America, or threatened to do so, or invaded them or gone to war with them based on the perception that they were allowing onto their soil the Russians or the Chinese or whomever that we felt was too threatening. Because our view is, for the entire region near us, we rule that region. We can overthrow your government, we can invade you if you allow anything on your soil that we regard as threatening. That was what John Bolton just said. And that has been the policy of the United States government for a long time. And therefore, we don't want Chinese troops near our border. And we should tell the Cubans, if you don't immediately withdraw that agreement to have them there, we may overthrow your government. Now, the reality is the United States government has been attempting to overthrow the Cuban government for decades. We sponsored an invasion of Cuba in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs, and it was a complete disaster. It was a debacle. That's what led JFK to fire, finally, the CIA director, Allen Dulles, out of embarrassment about what a disaster that operation was. But ever since, the United States has been trying to overthrow the Cuban government through blockades that have starved its population. Why are we blockading the Cuban government? Why is it the business of the United States what government Cuba has? And I've asked that question before. If you're an America First adherent or somebody who believes in an anti-war posture, what right does the United States have to go starving populations around the world in order to get rid of the government that we dislike, which we're doing in Venezuela, in Syria, in Cuba? The argument is these are countries that can threaten us based on what happens on their soil, and therefore we have the right to take action, including military action, to prevent it in response. Now, just to note, the Pentagon denies this report that the Chinese are building a listening post in Cuba. There you see the Hill on June 8th when the Wall Street Journal came out. It says, quote, the Defense Department is denying reports that China has reached a deal with Cuba to build an electronic eavesdropping facility on the island nation. Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Pat Ryder called a Wall Street Journal report on the apparent deal, quote, inaccurate during a briefing on Thursday. But again, there was subsequent Wall Street Journal reporting just yesterday or this week that provided more details. Now, the question I have is this. I actually have two questions. The Russian government, when it has been funding and supporting a civil war, a separatist movement in eastern Ukraine since 2014, when the United States government effectively changed the government of Ukraine and installed a pro-American leader, even though the democratically elected president's term was not up, we helped remove that leader by working with Ukrainian forces to do so. And then we all heard that videotape of Victoria Nuland choosing the next leader of Ukraine right on the most sensitive part of the Russian border. And then for 8 years, the United States has been arming Ukraine. You probably remember the scandal involving Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden was about the fact that the energy company Burisma paid Hunter Biden $50,000 a month to sit on its board because they wanted access to Joe Biden. Why did they want access to Joe Biden? Why would Ukrainians want access to Joe Biden? Joe Biden's the American vice president, not the Ukrainian one. The answer was because the United States had been running Ukraine as like a colonial puppet since we installed that government in 2014. And the view of the Russians has been exactly the same view that the United States has of Cuba, as you just heard it expressed by John Bolton, and through decades of behavior, which is, of course it's in our interest what happens right on the other side of our border. We're not going to let NATO and the United States run wild in Ukraine. And the argument of the U.S. administration and the establishment wings of both parties that support this war is that Ukraine is a sovereign country. Russia has no right to object to anything that Ukraine does. It's Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian soil, and Russia has no right to react in any way. So then how can anyone justify the U.S. taking exactly the opposite position when it comes to Chinese bases in Cuba and say that, well, because Cuba is so close to the United States, or El Salvador and Nicaragua are so close to the United States, or Chile, or Brazil, or Colombia are so close to the United States, that we have the right to intervene and overthrow governments and go to war if they allow anything on their soil that threatens us? How do you reconcile those views? Unless you want to say, which is at least honest, well, the U.S. is good and therefore can do whatever it wants, and Russia is bad and therefore it can't. But to pretend that there's some kind of principle at stake here is obviously confounding. And in fact, not only did the United States invade Cuba in 1961 because of concerns that it was getting too close to Moscow, the United States almost started a nuclear war in 1962 out of concern about Russian missiles in Cuba that the Cubans had invited them to put there precisely to protect them from United States aggression, since the United States had just tried to overthrow the Cuban government the year before. We didn't just threaten to invade, we almost started a nuclear war based on the principle that what happens right near a border is, of course, of great interest to us, and we will go to war to prevent it. So how, if that's our position, can we then turn around and tell the Russians that they have no right to object to the Americans and Europeans and all of NATO running wild in Ukraine, right on the side of their border that was twice used to invade Russia in the 20th century? And remember, in World War II, Russia lost 1/7 of its population. 1/7. Tens of millions of people to defeat the Nazis. So right now, they look at that same part of the border where they were twice invaded, and they look over at Germany, run by fanatical warmongers, particularly these people in the Green Party, these women who ran on the basis of ushering in a feminist foreign policy that they said was going to be less aggressive, and instead they're fanatical about arming the Ukrainians to fight Russia. And you now again have German tanks moving east right up to the Russian border. We interviewed Sarah Wagenknecht, who's the leader of the German Left Party, one of the few voices in Germany opposed to this war. And she said, imagine how traumatizing it is for Russia to have German tanks right again going to the Russian border through Ukraine. But the Russians look over their border and see what's happening in Ukraine, and they regard that as infinitely more concerning than how the U.S. sees what's happening in Cuba with China. And yet the position of the establishment and the bipartisan consensus seems to be we have every right to even use military aggression against China, against Cuba, to remove the Chinese, but the Russians have no say at all in what happens in Ukraine. Let me propose another issue, which is that if you listen to American officials, they are saying things like it is extremely disturbing that the Chinese would want to have a military presence so close to American soil in Cuba. At the very same time, and when I had RFK Jr. on my show, he talked about this a lot and said how provocative and needlessly antagonistic it was. The United States has physically encircled China with military bases in Guam and the Philippines and South Korea and Japan and Australia, with nuclear-tipped missiles pointed at Chinese cities and B-52 aircraft that are nuclear capable. And we're constantly buzzing along the Chinese border. And our argument is, this is not China's soil. This is international waters or international airspace or the countries of Guam and the Philippines and South Korea, and they want us there. But then we turn around and tell Cuba they don't have that same right. Let's look at the BBC from February of this year. You see there, the U.S. secures a deal on Philippines bases to complete an arc around China. And it reads, quote, the U.S. has secured access to 4 additional military bases in the Philippines, a key bit of real estate which would offer a front row seat to monitor the Chinese in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. With the deal, Washington has stitched the gap in the arc of U.S. alliances stretching from South Korea and Japan in the north to Australia in the south. The missing link had been the Philippines, which borders 2 of the biggest potential flashpoints, Taiwan and the South China Sea. The deal, which in part reverses the U.S.'s departure from their former colony more than 30 years ago, is no small matter. Indeed, it is no small matter. Here from March of 2023 is the Japan Times, headlined, "An Anxious Asia, Arms for a War it Hopes to Prevent." Quote, to minimize risk and maximize deterrence, U.S. officials have been hunting for real estate. The Philippines, Japan, Australia, Palau, Papua New Guinea, and U.S. territories across the Pacific are all working with Defense Department officials on expanding military access and facilities, often with the U.S. proposing investments in shared infrastructure. Also from March of 2022 in the Asian Times, U.S.-led alliances are slowly but surely encircling China. The AUKUS alliance, which is Australia, the U.S., and the U.K., reveals its nuclear plans, while emerging U.S., Japan, Philippines military alignment changes the calculus around Taiwan. Again, we're physically encircling China. At once, two different trilateral alliances are emerging, both built around America's, quote, integrated deterrence strategy amid intensified fears of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in the near-term future. On the one hand, the U.S., UK, and Australia have taken a fateful step in their AUKUS alliance by greenlighting the production of a new fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, drawing on cutting-edge Rolls-Royce nuclear reactors, all right near the Chinese homeland. In the next 5 years, the U.S. and UK are also expected to station nuclear submarines in the Western Australian capital of Perth, while Canberra is slated to purchase several U.S.-made Virginia-class submarines over the next decade. The AUKUS submarine deal allows the three Anglophone allies to project power across the region, especially in the contested waters across the so-called First Island chain, which extends from the East China Sea to the Taiwan Strait and all the way across the South China Sea. Meanwhile, there is a burgeoning Japan-Philippines-U.S. JAFA's trilateral alliance in the making, with similar strategic objectives and even greater geographic immediacy. The upshot is a fast-emerging tripartite defense framework, which will be indispensable to an effective deterrence strategy against China over Taiwan and the broader First Island chain theater. Both Japan and the Philippines, Taiwan's most immediate neighbors, are undergoing foreign policy revolutions. For its part, Tokyo is recasting its post-World War II pacifist foreign policy by embracing a more proactive strategic role in the region, just like Germany is doing. Japan is now contemplating the prospect of exporting sophisticated weapon systems to besieged nations, notably Ukraine. In preparation for a potential showdown over the island of Taiwan, the U.S. has stepped up its drills across the Western Pacific with a growing emphasis on so-called, quote, distributed lethality, namely increasing the offensive power of individual components of surface force and then employing them in dispersed offensive formations known as hunter-killer SAGs. Now, if you want to say that the U.S. is justified in putting nuclear-powered submarines and nuclear-tipped missiles and nuclear-capable B-52s all around the region of China, surrounding it, encircling it physically, then I want to hear the principle that says that the U.S. can simultaneously treat as some sort of act of aggression the Cuban invitation to China to put military bases on Cuban soil. Now, again, if you're somebody who just believes that the U.S. is so inherently good that it can do things other countries are banned from doing, and you say that, I'll at least respect that for being candid. But if you want to pretend that you're applying some sort of principles or values, universal values of foreign policy, it is difficult, to say the least, to simultaneously justify massive deployments all throughout the Pacific, physically encircling China, flying planes of every kind, spy planes and fighter jets right off their coast, while acting outraged that now there's a Chinese base in Cuba. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.